Hi, everyone. We'll begin shortly. I'd just like to remind everyone that we are recording this hearing. Commissioners, you will have the option to turn on your audio and video shortly. We're just waiting for everyone to join. Thank you. Thank you, commissioners and everyone for holding. We are now going to turn on the ability for you to start your video and your audio.
Hello, so how are we all doing? Did you hear me?
We do.
Good, okay.
We do hear you, and I think other people are joining in now.
There we go. Oh, I'm jealous of David Byer's background. That's out your back window, isn't it, David?
David, you're muted, actually.
Yeah.
I believe at your end.
Yes, it's my front window.
Yeah, that's even better.
Ethan, I like the tie and the haircut.
Well,
Very nicely done.
It's the first haircut in many months, although as you and I, as you know, you and I are always the tie. We're keeping up standards here, Mr. Vice Chair. And I believe, Mr. Chairman, I think we have all of the commissioners tomorrow. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe all the commissioners are here except for Commissioner Buiza. Oh, she is with us now, I'm told.
Yeah, we're just waiting for Dan. Oh, no, she's here. Everybody's here.
I'm here.
All right, good.
Wow.
Mr. Chairman, I think all the commissioners are here.
Well, welcome everybody. I trust we're all healthy and safe, and it's a pleasure to see you again, even though it's electronically. Let me start with some opening remarks. So I'm Pedro Nava, the chairman of the Little Hoover Commission, and I want to thank you all again for being here. I want to introduce the other commissioners who are here with us on Zoom. We have Vice Chair Sean Varner, Commissioners Dion Aroner, David Byer, Cynthia Buisa, Bill Emerson. Is Mr. Emerson?
I believe
Okay.
he is, yes.
Bill's here, thank you. Kathy Schwamberger and Janice Sidley. Also with us today are the commission staff, Executive Director Ethan Rarick, Deputy Executive Director Tamar Foster, Project Manager Crystal Beckham, and Analyst Sherry McAllister, Ashley Hurley, and Rachel Mattioli. Let me do some housekeeping before we turn to the subject. Commissioners' audio and video will be turned on throughout the duration of the hearing. Commissioners, you may mute yourself if you wish. Please remember to unmute yourself if you want to make a comment or ask a question during the hearing. The video and audio of our hearing witnesses will be turned on when it is their turn to speak. Members of the public will be muted during the hearing. As is standard for the commission, we have a public comment session at the end. We will have public comment. Those who wish to make comment will be unmuted during that part of the session at the end of the hearing. If you want to make a public comment, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom by clicking on the hand icon to join the public comment queue. If you decide you don't want to make a comment, click on the icon again to lower your hand. Those who have joined us by phone may send an email to littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov, indicating you would like to address the commission. You must provide the phone number from which you have joined the meeting so that our staff knows who to unmute. Staff will be monitoring raised hands and emails requesting comment throughout the duration of our meeting. As usual at commission meetings, public comment is limited to 3 minutes per speaker. We are recording today's hearing, and after the meeting, staff will place a permanent link to the recording on our website and upload it to the YouTube channel. Now let us turn to our critically important topic of today's hearing, and let me take a moment to express again my appreciation to staff for the excellent background memo. The COVID-19 pandemic, it has quickly and drastically affected life as we know it. Thousands of our fellow Californians have lost their lives to this disease, leaving behind irreplaceable gaps in families and communities across the state. Millions of others have lost their livelihoods. The unemployment rate has reached record highs, as have demands for government aid and assistance. Preliminary data and projections suggest that the pandemic will have a far deeper impact than any other economic downturn California has faced in decades. Numerous challenges await California's leaders as they seek to kickstart the state's economy, provide for struggling families, and protect the most vulnerable among us. At the Little Hoover Commission, we are uniquely suited to provide insight and guidance to policymakers as they begin this imperative work. That's why we're launching a study of the long-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on California's economy. Through a series of 3 hearings this summer, we will identify the likely challenges that California will face, their effect on state government, and how state government can best respond to support those who are impacted by the pandemic. Today, we begin the first hearing of the summer series. The economic experts joining us today will help us examine how the pandemic will alter California's economy over the next 2 to 5 years, and how businesses and workers will be affected. We will continue this conversation next month as we hold 2 hearings examining the fiscal impact of COVID-19 on California's government and the changes in organization and policy that may be needed in response. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here with us today and for sharing your expertise with the Commission. The insight that you provide is critical as we consider and formulate policy recommendations that can help California during this time of unprecedented need. And now, Ethan, would you please introduce our witnesses?
I will, Mr. Chairman. We have 3 witnesses today. Jerry Nickelsburg, who is the director of the UCLA Anderson Forecast, Dr. Mark Schniepp, who is the director of the California Economic Forecast, and Kevin Klowden, who is the executive director of the Center for Regional Economics and the California Center, which are part of the Milken Institute. Dr. Nickelsburg will go first, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. I did want to mention to commissioners that we are now securing witnesses for the 2nd and 3rd hearings in this series, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman. We do know that on July 9th, we will also hear from Professor Marianne Page of UC Davis, who leads their Center for Poverty Research. She will be focused particularly on the impact on low-income people and on economic mobility. And we are close to confirming several other witnesses, and we'll let the Commission know as we line up other witnesses. But today we begin with the broad overview of the impact on the California economy, and the first witness is Dr. Jerry Nickelsburg, who is, as I mentioned, director of the UCLA Anderson Forecast, with which many of you are familiar. As director of the Anderson Forecast, Dr. Nickelsburg plays a key role in the economic modeling and forecasting of both the national and California economies. He was formerly a professor of economics at USC and also previously held a position with the Federal Reserve Board developing forecasting tools, and he has advised banks, investors, and financial institutions throughout his career. The Anderson Forecast is a leading California economic forecast, and so we're very honored to have Dr. Nickelsburg joining us today. So, Dr. Nickelsburg.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. Let me share my screen. What I'd like to do is start off with just a few remarks about our latest forecast for California. And so if you bear with me just one moment, I'll bring up the first slide. So let me take just a few minutes to go through what our forecast is for California and what that means kind of sector by sector, and by implication, what that means for not only the number of folks who are most affected by this recession, but also their income status and their ability to move to the other side of this recession and achieve reemployment. So we begin with the title here, which is the uncertain state. And I have that as my title because one thing that is really quite important as you listen to all of the forecasts today and through the summer is to understand that all of us are making assumptions about the course of this pandemic. And we're not epidemiologists, and as you know, the epidemiologists themselves don't agree as to what's going to happen as we go forward with through the pandemic, nor do we know what the policy response is going to be to that. And somehow this just moved forward. So we all have to make an assumption about the pandemic, and it's just that, an assumption. It's not a forecast. For the UCLA Anderson forecast, the assumption that we made that allows us to do an economic forecast is that the pandemic eases through the summer, and that to the extent that it's around in 2021 and 2022, it has a minor impact on economic activity, which could be because we have a vaccine and mass vaccination. It could be just an abatement of the pandemic. There are many reasons why that might happen, but what's important to realize is the extent to which that assumption is too optimistic, so is our forecast. Okay, so let's proceed and talk about why this time is different. On the left-hand side, you see previous recessions, and they're the years 1990, 2001, and 2008, the last three recessions, which really involved a very slow recovery. But in 1990, we were impacted disproportionately here in California by the aerospace contraction at the end of the Cold War. 500,000 Californians lost their jobs. That was 4% of the payroll jobs in California, and that transpired over 35 months. In 2001, we lost 300,000 payroll jobs, or 2% of the payroll jobs in the state. Disproportionately affected California because that was part of the dot-com bust. That transpired over 12 months. And in 2008, the Great Recession, 1.3 million jobs were lost, 8% of our workforce. And again, California was disproportionately affected because of the speculative boom in home construction, but also the location of subprime mortgage finance here in California. That 1.3 million happened over 26 months. Now, the title of this slide is "This Time is Different," and if you look to the right-hand side, the employment decline was double that of the Great Recession, 2.625 million jobs, or 15% of the payroll jobs, and all of that happened over a 2-month span. So right there, it shows that there's a difference. There's another kind of fundamental difference here, and that affects the recovery. And that is that the pandemic induced the recession because of the public health crisis. And what I mean by that is the public health crisis had us reduce our demand for a whole bunch of services that we might otherwise have purchased. In all of these previous recessions, demand was reduced because we had enough war material and aerospace for the Cold War. We had enough housing. We had enough computers and software. In this case, the decline in demand was in order to fight a public health crisis, and that makes it kind of fundamentally different. The way in which we do the California forecast is to first do a forecast for the United States and then ask what is different about California. So let's just turn to that question and look at payroll jobs. What you see in this slide is the percentage decline in payroll jobs from February to April of 2020. The blue is the US and the gold is California. I use April instead of May because the May numbers for the US include opening up of some states, whereas California did not. So this is much more of an apples to apples comparison. If you look on the left-hand side on payroll jobs, you see that California and the US are just about the same. They're in the middle 14%. There are 4 sectors that I have highlighted here. I'll show you why I highlighted only those 4 sectors momentarily. The first is leisure and hospitality, a huge decrease. But again, the US and California are very similar. The US a little bit worse, but still very similar and statistically the same. Then on the right-hand side, the next sector that has the greatest percentage loss is other services, and the middle 2 are retail, trade, healthcare, and social services. All of those look very much like the US. And so unlike those previous 3 recessions that I showed you, California's recovery ought to look a lot like the US. There's going to be some nuanced differences, but California is not disproportionately hit in this recession relative to the US as it has been in the previous 3. So let's take a look at the number of folks who have been displaced, and we're going to look at those 4 sectors, but also all other sectors in California. This is again the change from February to April of 2020, and if you look on the right-hand side, they're the largest 2, retail, trade, and leisure and hospitality. Those 2 sectors account for 50% of all job loss in California. And if we add in the next 2, healthcare and social services and other services, so those were the 4 that I showed you in the last slide, that's 2/3 of all jobs that are lost in California. And you might say, well, that's kind of an arbitrary cutoff point. It looks like the next one is just about the same size. So the next 3 are administrative services, construction, and education. And I'll make a comment on those momentarily as we move to look at what happened between April and May in California. So this is exactly the same slide, except for there's added to this slide these blue blocks, and the blue blocks represent a job loss February to May now of 2020, whereas the red are still February to April. And again, you notice leisure and hospitality and retail, half the job loss, add in healthcare, social services, and other services, and you get 2/3 of the job loss. But let's look at 3 other sectors, the ones that I just mentioned. Administrative services, some job gain. So why is that? Well, included in administrative services are building services, sanitation services, janitorial services. So you would expect to have some mitigation of the job loss there. And then next is construction. And this is really a bright spot. Construction has started to come back. Fairly significant increase in jobs over April, and we expect that to continue. I'm going to talk about that momentarily when I get to housing. And then education, increased job loss in education, but a lot of that is because our schools are closed, and so the support services for schools are no longer needed, but they will be needed in the fall when the schools open up. And the opening up of the schools is really an important component of the recovery. So moving on, the state budget. So in the governor's budget message, he said that we had a $54 billion deficit. As you know, an agreement has been reached between the legislature and the executive branch of our government. And instead of the 30% or 1/3 cut in spending that 54 billion might represent, it's really something much smaller, and it's going to be about 8 to 10% cuts. So those are cuts that will hurt, but it is important to note what the governor is doing here in this picture, that we have a rainy day fund in California that's about $20 billion, including some other special emergency funds. And the state has paid down debt, so it has increased borrowing capacity. And all of that is a result of 10 years of thinking about this recession on the part of Sacramento. So I think it's important to note that we've had 10 years since the Great Recession. We may or may not have 10 years before the next recession. And as we go forward, this cushion really is helping out California, and one can't leave that behind in looking towards the next recession, the one after the 2020 recession.
Excuse me,
Because
Mr. Nickelsburg, somebody's on the phone and chatting. If I could ask that people either mute or something. I'm very hard to focus strictly on what you're saying. It's so thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt.
okay,
Thank you.
no problem.
We will, Jana, we will try to figure out who that is and mute that person, so.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Ethan. Thank you.
So the point here is that for 10 years, California's thought about this recession. And so the state government is not in the kind of bind that many state governments are. It still is going to need to reduce its expenditures, but not nearly by 1/3. And we can't lose sight of that going forward, because that's certainly a benefit that the state has. Now, local governments that are more heavily dependent on sales tax don't have, nearly this cushion, but at least at the state level, there is some cushion to rely on. Let's take a look at the smaller of the four sectors that we were looking at before, and those are other services. And the components of other services are personal care, religious organizations, auto repair, and other maintenance. Now, auto repair took a deep dive in the contraction, but that's because we weren't driving. So we expect that to come back fairly rapidly. Personal care involves person-to-person contact. This is where you have nail salons, where you have other kinds of personal care. That's going to be a little slower to come back, but we do expect that to come back over the next 2 years.
Can I interrupt for a question?
Sure.
I'm interested in your testimony, but just maybe if you could comment as you go along, the effect on small businesses, particularly minority-owned small businesses. There are something like 3.9 million small businesses in California, employing hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And some of the areas that you're focusing on use personal care as an example, retail, restaurants. There are very, very many small businesses. And in some economically distressed communities, which are hardest hit by COVID-19, in a healthcare sense, are also going to be hurt the most economically. And eventually, I think the commission's going to want to be looking at recommendations of how to best help small businesses, especially minority-owned small businesses, is going to be our longer-term task. So if you could comment as you go along about whether there's any small business component or unique way of calling that out, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure, that is a very important point. What I want to do here is highlight the aggregate of these sectors. When I get to the forecast, I want to address that, because that is really a critical point when we think about policy in the recovery. And who is going to be suffering most in this recession and recovery, your point is not only well taken, but it is directly on point. So let me hold off a little bit on that, but I do want to come back to that because that is important and ought not to get lost here. But the point that I'm trying to make on other services is there are a whole lot of different activities that go into other services, and those activities will have increasing demand as we recover. And we're going to recover in about the same way as the US, and this sector should as well. So now turning to healthcare and social services, this is dental offices, physical therapy, and doctor's offices. They shut down for two reasons. One was to make room, create capacity for treatment of COVID-19 patients, but also a fear of transmission in these dental offices and physical therapy locations and so on. Those activities, we expect the demand to come back. Certainly dental and doctor's offices are putting protocols in place to make people feel safe. And again, this is a sector that we expect to be recovering right along with the US. Daycare is also in this sector. And of course, daycare will return as people return to work. Now, moving to the larger two of the big four sectors, the first thing that I want to point out is that tourism is important in California. We know that, but overseas tourism is certainly critically important. And the chart that you see on the right-hand side of this slide is the percentage, it's the market share, the percentage of overseas visitors to the United States that go to various states. And California is number 3 with over 20% market share. The reason why that's important is for overseas visitors to get here, they have to take a long flight on an airplane, first. And second, the rest of the world views the US as having done a very poor job in managing the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. And so there's a lot of nervousness about coming to the US. Indeed, right now on the 2 schedules that are being considered by the EU for which countries are not going to be allowed to send visitors to the EU, the United States is on both lists. So we don't expect international tourism, which is important in California, to come back anytime soon. Let's take a little deeper dive into these big 2 sectors. Leisure and hospitality, we have fear of flying, domestic as well as foreign. Amusement park phobia, the fear of being in large crowds. And bar phobia, same thing, but with alcohol involved. For retail, brick and mortar retail was overbuilt in California going into this recession. As we expanded in the longest expansion in US history, we find that retail was shedding jobs, 35,000 jobs lost in the year prior to the recession. So we expected this to be a sector that would be hit very hard, and indeed it is. And tourism is also a part of retail, as well as mall phobia, again, the fear of being in large crowds. So how do we get a handle on what that means for the economy? We were looking for when did we last see fear affect demand? And that was in fear of flying, and that was in the attacks at 9/11. What you see here is US airline revenue passenger miles. That's one person on a domestic flight who has paid for their seat flying 1 mile. And the big drop there is because of the 9/11 attacks. The chart goes from January 2000 to October 2004, and it took 31 months before you see a recovery in traffic to the levels that were pre-9/11. Now, the data here, this recovery, is confounded by the fact that in March of 2001, we entered into a recession. Nationwide, it was a very mild recession, but it was a recession nonetheless, and recessions mean less demand for travel. There have been a number of studies on this. The one that we reference here is by Ito and Lee, 2004, and they separated out the income effect and the fear of flying the fear, you get a real sharp snapback. And we're seeing that with opening up. People are going back to restaurants. They really want to be social. But what Ito and Lee found was that even at the end of 30 months, there was still about a 7.5% decline in demand. And it took 31 months to get back when you had the increase in income. If we substitute our national forecast for income, employment, and unemployment into this model, what we get is by the end of 2022, 20% below the peak. And we think that that's about a good number for retail and for leisure and hospitality, and it corresponds very much to what we have in our model. Now, turning to housing, what you see here, California home sales, is the source is the California Association of Realtors, falls off a cliff in May of 2020 because if you can't go see a home, you're much less likely to buy it. But nationwide, that's come back pretty rapidly, and there are indications that's going to happen in California. And also, prices on the right-hand side are median home prices in California, and they decline, but not by a lot. On the left-hand side is the Case-Shiller Home Price Index. This is prior to the recession, but you see for coastal cities, prices still appreciating. What that means is that the home building industry is not in as bad shape as it might look in first blush. And in fact, our forecast is for a sharp drop in May. The green is actual new residential permits. So a sharp drop in that in May, but then fairly steady growth. And this is going to be a source of job growth, as you saw in the April to May numbers, an increase in employment and construction. We expect that to continue and to reach kind of new recent highs in home construction, but that's still only going to be about 11,000 units per month. Not nearly enough to build out of the home affordability crisis, but certainly an important part of the recovery. So that leads to the forecast. We are predicting a total decline in real personal income from peak to trough, excluding the transfers in that first support package of 3%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is in fact significant. And here I do want to come back to small business and in particular what communities are most affected, because the total decline in payroll employment we're expecting is 13%. So why is there a big difference here? The big difference goes back to what we were just talking about: retail, leisure and hospitality, other services. These are sectors which are predominantly low-income sectors. They're sectors that employ disproportionately people from underserved communities and minority businesses. And this is where the real pain of this recession comes in, because these are personal services. These are person-to-person kinds of businesses. And those are the ones that are hit by what we are calling fear of flying, or this phobia of being in large crowds. And our view is that we're not going to return to a peak in this employment until after the end of our forecast, until 2023, and in some of these sectors, like leisure and hospitality, not until 2024. So the growth of the California economy coming out of this recession, which you see on the left-hand side, is going to be relatively rapid. It's going to be led by construction, advanced manufacturing, so that's sophisticated manufacturing involving engineers and technical people, and technology. And it's not going to be bringing along with it very rapidly leisure and hospitality, retail, and some aspects of other services. And one of the things that is going to be happening that will be lasting through this year and potentially into the first part of 2021 is that many of these small businesses are going to be going bankrupt and then laying off their workforce. It will take time for the demand to come back, for new firms to start and to hire those folks. But in retail, we don't expect a full recovery. And so there are many low-income Californians who are going to need to move into other kinds of economic activities to find employment, and perhaps need other kinds of training in order to move into those other activities because their jobs are not coming back very fast. And so what I want to leave you with from this short presentation is this image of a hiker going through the woods just looking at the trees. We're in the middle of this, and we're looking at the trees. We have an idea of what's going to happen, but we had to make an assumption about the course of the pandemic. We're not really where we can see the forest, but hopefully we have something of a guide that will help us as we see more and more trees and more of the forest. And so let me stop there, and I'm happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
Sure. Can I go back to the small business question? We've seen some data from various academic institutions about the PPP small business loan oriented effort. And we don't have a lot of data because the administration declined to disclose that until last week. But there's some evidence to suggest that that program was especially ineffective with respect to the smaller of small businesses. That is, small businesses that have fewer than 25 people. Do you have, or could you point us to attempts to deal with that subset? Because as I understand it, in minority-owned businesses, it's especially true that they're on the smaller end of the small business continuum. And if you have any policy recommendations about how to deal with that, I know the legislature and the governor have put in place a $100 million fund for the iBank, which is part of the GoBiz operation, for loan guarantees, which will be particularly important, I believe, for the smaller of these small businesses. Any thoughts on that?
Sure. So let me make two comments. One is that I don't know anything more than you know about the implementation of PPP. I do know that it distorts our employment numbers, but the program has, at least to this point, been somewhat opaque, right? The economics of it are as follows. If you keep individuals employed until their firms are able to earn enough to be paying them out of their revenue, then you don't break the employer-employee relationship. And so the reemployment is much easier and faster than if you allow those individuals to become unemployed and transfer to them the same amount of money that they would have received under PPP. When a firm lays off workers and it's not furloughed, then those workers have to search for another job. That takes time. That's much more costly. And so the concept behind PPP was to ease the damage and not break this worker-employer relationship. That's going to run out. So what I fear is that when we get to the end of that program, however effective or ineffective it might have been, you still get the breaking of that relationship. And that's what was important about PPP. There does seem to be some indication that it was tilted towards actually more successful businesses, and it was much harder to get for small businesses, particularly those who didn't have a lot of knowledge about how to do this. I have, this is just anecdotal, but a couple of friends who have small businesses, and I said, well, why don't you apply for this? And they actually didn't really have the knowledge. And I think that's probably even more prevalent in minority communities. So I think you're right about that. What are the policy recommendations? It's hard to say, but those are the folks who are going to be hardest hit in this recovery, as I said, and have the longest term unemployment. So that's the real policy issue to be addressed.
Dr. Nickelsburg, under your healthcare and social services discussion, there was no mention on impact on California's hospitals, and more specifically on California's rural hospitals. And I was just wondering, since hospitals were not allowed to do elective procedures for a long period of time, this has been an incredibly difficult time, and many hospitals, I think, potentially face bankruptcy. And I was just wondering if you'd addressed any of those issues.
So you're absolutely correct that this has been a financial strain on hospitals. We see it in the University of California healthcare system. You know, many of our universities, including UCLA, have large healthcare components to them. And that elective surgery and some of the other activities that take place in those hospitals and in those healthcare centers have provided quite a bit of income to support them. I think at least what I read, and I have not done any studies on this, in rural California, as well as rural United States, small community hospitals were in trouble going into this crisis. And this has just made it worse. So that's certainly an issue that needs to be discussed in the context of the entire discussion about what does our healthcare system look like in the state? How are we serving Californians? How can we do it better? And to the extent, if you think about sort of the rural or inland communities of California, many of them, many people live a long distance from healthcare. And if those hospitals indeed go bankrupt, as is suggested, they will live even further from adequate healthcare. So I think that's an important issue, but we don't have any specific studies on it.
So, Dr. Nickelsburg, this is Janice Sidley. I have a question as well. I thought it was fascinating that you showed in your analysis that California and the United States losing jobs were all almost identical. I mean, a bit different in certain areas, but almost identical. My question is actually if there are any studies, projections, estimates about coming out of this, and whether or not California and the rest of the US would be as similarly situated, or if, California prides itself on cleaner air, cleaner water. We have more requirements, and is there any indication that as we're trying to lift up these small businesses, get people back on their feet, that this may promote or hinder that relative to the rest of the country? I'd like to hope that we would be equal to, but I just looking for some data on that, because obviously then policy decisions about whether or not you relax something or put something else in place might come into this discussion.
Sure. So it really is mixed in terms of leisure and hospitality, and to some extent retail. The tourism component is going to affect California disproportionate to the US, and that's in a negative way. Right? Technology is going to affect California disproportionately in a positive way. But those are high income sectors. One of the consequences of this pandemic and the induced recession is the reevaluation of supply chains. And we're going to see some onshoring of manufacturing that was previously in China. But that onshoring of manufacturing that comes back to the US is going to be capital intensive. It's going to be advanced manufacturing using robotics, not using many people. And the kind of individuals who are going to be employed in that are not traditional manufacturing workers. They're going to be robotics technicians. They're going to be technically trained people. And it's not that we can't train Californians for that. We can, and indeed in many ways we are. But California is uniquely situated for that because we do have a highly trained workforce. But it points where policy can really help the folks who are most hurt by this recession. In underserved communities, we spoke a moment ago about minority communities, providing transitions into technical fields like robotics technicians, who can then find higher paying jobs and really move up in economic status. Now, the other place where California is going to be affected disproportionate to the US is in logistics. So California is the port of entry for goods from Asia. The president has indicated in no uncertain terms that he is going to make, as part of his campaign for re-election, the notion that he is tough on China. The rhetoric between the US and China is data indicating that that's true, but also on the Chinese side. And so expect to see the trade wars actually intensify. And that affects the volume of goods through our ports. It affects warehousing. It affects trucking and transportation and port workers. So that's, and Californians will be disproportionately hurt by that.
I don't know if you know, but I'm the general counsel for the Port of Los Angeles. So I'm
Yes.
living what you're talking about right now. And the tariffs were the first hit, and then COVID. Certainly we have seen a change in supply chain where people are moving, if they can, production out of China into places like Vietnam. Vietnam, interestingly, if you go from there, you sail to the East Coast, not to the West Coast. Last month, New York, New Jersey was the #1 port in the United States, not Los Angeles. So this month we're down about 30% of our cargo. So what you're saying, sir, is very much happening on a daily basis here at the port.
Yeah, and this also affects California agriculture.
Oh, yes.
The trade wars, international trade is important for California agriculture, and the trade wars disproportionately affect California in that sense. Now, that's in income, not in jobs, because agriculture is highly mechanized, but it does affect California, not disproportionate to Iowa, but on average to the US, to be sure.
I think Commissioner Eriner indicated a
Yeah.
question.
I do, thank you. I mean, looking in the other services, you mentioned daycare, but you really didn't go in childcare, however you want to call it. But you didn't go into it very much. And I've been involved in that sector for a very long time. And what we're trying to figure out is how do low-income women of color, right, who are impacted by the recession, by the economic recession right now, probably more than anybody else. Many of them are the providers of care, all right, but also they are the receivers of care. And then middle-class women, right, who are working and have gone home to stay with their children because there is no school for them. How do you see working women coming back into the workforce if the childcare sector not only doesn't bounce back, because it was significantly hurt with the Great Recession. We lost around 1 million slots during that time that government paid for, right? We are nowhere close to replacing those slots, even today, after all these years. And now with the pandemic, childcare centers, for example, closed down. Around 60% of childcare centers closed in California. The bulk of the work's been done by small family childcare providers that can take maybe up to 14 children, but around 35% of them also closed down. And so the question is, how do women, mostly women, go back to work when they can't find childcare for their children? And the schools are trying to figure out whether or not they're going to be on half day, or they're going to be some kids that go on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and some go on Tuesday and Thursday. How does this all work out for families that want to return to work, but can't find childcare for their kids.
Yeah, and as you respond to that, let me just suggest to the commissioners, we've got two other panelists, so maybe we can kind of wrap this section up. Thank you.
So that's an important question. And, you know, the child care, daycare business is going to respond to the demand. And, you know, part of that is schools have to open up. If schools don't open up, then I think you're going to see a real lagging in the demand, and our forecast for that sector, that subsector, to come back as kind of rapidly as the US is going to be too optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but as jobs come back, then you would expect the demand. Now, you mentioned minority businesses, particularly women of color, disproportionately are working in retail and in leisure and hospitality. Those would be slow sectors to come back. Means the demand for childcare from those folks is going to be slow to come back. And that will certainly impact that sector. So I think that's right. I mean, you know, one has to think of this holistically, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Good. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think you've given us an awful lot of information that we're going to be able to tie back into developing our recommendations and our policy considerations.
Thank you for the invitation. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to email me.
Thank you very much. Ethan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next witness is Dr. Mark Schniepp, who is the director of the California Economics Forecast, which prepares forecasts and commentary on the California economy, and particularly on regional economies in California. The Economics Forecast has worked with many businesses and public sector clients through the years. Previously, Dr. Schniepp served as senior economist to Kathleen Connell when she was the state controller from 1999 to 2003. He also served as director of the Economic Forecast Project at UC Santa Barbara between 1985 and 2000. Dr. Schniepp.
Okay, thanks, Ethan. Can you see my full screen now?
We can.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to follow up on Jerry, try not to overlap too much with him, but so I'll be dealing with some of the regions of California and how we are going to recover from the situation that we're in. And that'll have important implications for the next 2 to 5 years in California. Right now, we have a slow reopening of the economy, where most of the economies are in phase 2B. And that certainly is providing some clear relief for consumers who have had cabin heat fever for the past few months. So consumers have increased their mobility. We can see that from the mobility data. And this has led to a gradual economic pickup. We're seeing it all over. But because the reopening is so limited, it provides just a limited and temporary boost in demand that we're seeing right now. We need to continue to progress in opening up. And I realize that that's the idea, but hopefully we will not go backward on that, because that would be devastating for the economy and for workers. It still is the case that consumers' options to spend are restricted. I mean, it's just that simple. And retail stores are suffering from all of the constraints that they're currently under. So are restaurants to some extent. And this has implications on retail stores and small businesses. Small businesses, they dominate retail store ownership. And so to the extent that we can get retail operating again as quickly as possible, then we can avoid some of the longer term impacts on small businesses and on our minority business owners and minority workers in the retail industry, because it's so big and it's so muchly comprised of those types of workers. Now, we all know that there's been this historic devastation in the labor markets. April was the worst month of the pandemic. It looks like that is certainly the bottom. The largest unemployed states are these: Nevada's first, Hawaii, then Michigan, and California is tied for 4th worst in unemployment rates. And why is that? Well, what do they have in common? Nevada tourism, Hawaii tourism, the state of Michigan, not so much tourism, but the auto industry. And the auto industry was shut down entirely. But it did come back on May 18th. That's when everybody started to work again. However, that missed the unemployment rate numbers because that was done the previous week. And then, of course, California's tourism. So as Jerry said, and it's, you know, it's something to keep in mind, is that the tourism states and the tourism sectors, those are the hardest hit. So to the extent that we can get tourism going again, then we bypass these long-term deleterious economic implications for our economies. We conduct a real-time weekly unemployment rate calculation for the US and for California. We put it on our website every week, and I'll be calculating the current week from the unemployment claims that came out this morning as soon as I finish here. But right now, we've seen some improvement in the weekly unemployment rate for the US. It did peak at around 18.5%, and it's down now to about 15.8. So it is improving, but only gradually. There's not a big change in that yet. We still have 23 million people claiming unemployment insurance in this country. And in California's experience, this is through mid-June, we had a peak of about 19%, and we've been rising the last several weeks. We're currently about 16.3. So we're actually having more claims, and there were more claims today for initial unemployment. We got about 3.3 million people claiming insurance. So about a 16% unemployment rate right now. All 50 states have opened up to some extent, and it's been about 7 weeks now, but we're not seeing a V-shaped rebound. No, not at all. And so the biggest question that many business people have and many economists have is this one. You know, how is the economy going to recover? How does it do it from this massive unemployment and massive business failure? Can we snap back quickly? That's the biggest question. And that's an important question, because the quicker we can snap back, you know, the less long-term negative implications that we're going to see. So here are some of the issues. Clearly easing these lockdowns, which were intended to be temporary, that's just not going to be enough to restore economic activity to the pre-crisis levels. Just not enough. Why? It's because the supply side has changed so much. And Jerry talked about this. We have too many permanent business closures. And therefore, we've forever ended the relationship between many of these laid off workers and their parent companies by having the business go out. And so now all these workers can't go back to their old employment. They've got to find new employment, and that's going to take time. The demand side has also changed. Consumers are they're fearful, they're uncertain, they hesitate. We're not seeing them just jump back into restaurants, even though they've opened. And then, of course, they don't have as much income because so many of them are unemployed. And so, or their wealth has been hit hard by the lack of receiving rents and the downturn in the stock market. So there's two things, of course, affecting the demand side: lack of income and fear. So the biggest thing that we need to do is restore the confidence in consumers. That's going to be difficult, but it's absolutely critical to restoring demand. And as Jerry said at the end of his presentation, restoring demand is going to be the most critical component in getting this economy going again. We can restore supply by opening all back up, but we have to make consumers feel confident again and make sure their incomes are rising. So any new lockdowns, any more shelter in place, any more things like that, it would be devastating to the economy right now, leading to further erosion in confidence, which it's going to take that much longer to get it restored. And then more business failures, more layoffs, perhaps we'll be lapsing back into recession. So, you know, that's sort of the downside to what we're seeing right now with this very slow reopening. We don't know how that's all going to work out. We know that we were in a recession. It officially began in March. It likely ended sometime in early May. We're in the recovery period right now, so that you know, we believe because we're seeing growth, we're seeing jobs come back, we're seeing, you know, some stimulus occurring. It's likely the shortest recession that we have ever seen, but nevertheless, it's probably one of the most devastating. The downside risks to the recovery that we're currently in, we don't know much. That was that end slide that Jerry had at the end, where we can't really see the forest from the trees. How will the coronavirus evolve this year? We don't know that. We don't know what the response will be by our state and local governments, and we don't know how people are going to tolerate a response that they don't like either. I mean, there were already starting to be protests for shelter in place, you know, in April. I don't know how that would go this time around. Then you have the phased and gradual limitations during the current restart that may prove to be too restrictive, too long in duration, and that will cause businesses not to be able to operate profitably, and they just may end up closing. So yes, we've seen business failures already, but we may see a surge of them if we can't get them to operate efficiently going forward during the restart. Then you'll see more layoffs. And then of course, we need to get consumers feeling better about the economy and the distancing and the safety precautions that have put in place, because they've got concerns, and that's limiting their ability to open up with the rest of the firms in the economy. Now, the upside risk to the recovery is that consumers embrace the opening. They've been tired of staying inside. They want to get out. They go to restaurants. They go to salons. They go to whatever can be open right now, and there's strong demand. Okay, well, we haven't quite seen that yet, but we're waiting to see how that works out. And then we're looking at the vehicle demand and home demand. And it looks to us from the data that we have so far is that that's not going to be impacted as much. People are going to be buying cars, and they've just been able to postpone their home purchases. And so those two industries, which are big, employ a lot of people, can come back. We believe that those can come back relatively unscathed. There will be, of course, some fallout, but those will come back. And then we may have a situation where American industry innovates through all the constraints that we're currently in, and we can serve more people despite all the capacity constraints. Okay, and the safety that they display, it restores confidence to consumers, and demand does rise. So this may not be as difficult as we are assuming, but again, that would be an upside risk, and we don't know that yet, but we're hoping that that will be the case. We still have obstacles this summer that we have to get through in order to make our 2 to 5 year forecast much more beneficial to everyone. And that would be this: the capacity limitations combined with consumer reticence could produce a wave of business failures and new layoffs. So we hope that doesn't happen. We're watching that very carefully, and any policies that can be put in place to help protect us against this will go a long way to keeping the recovery period on mark, and we could get back up to where we were in a shorter period of time. But this is one of the biggest risks right here, what I've put on the screen right now. And unless travel rebounds with some momentum, hotels and the whole travel related business will fail and be forced to sell out or to merge with other companies or whatever. And so that could actually look kind of ugly over the next year or two as well. So we need to get travel restored as fast as possible. We need to get safety restored within the travel infrastructure. A couple of other things: property owners already are receiving less rental income from non-paying tenants, and forbearance on the part of banks for these property owners, well, that ends this summer. So we don't know how quite that's going to go, but we're in a period of forbearance right now. And then we're also in a period of drugging the economy. We have fiscal stimulus that's currently ongoing, and that ends this summer. We've got the Paycheck Protection Program that was supposed to support businesses for 2.5 months. Well, that ends this month or next for the most part. And then the $1,200 checks that everyone got are exhausted. essentially. You also have the great shutdown of all the public events in California and nationwide. That's not likely to be restored very soon. So that's an obstacle to employing a lot of people, to generating a lot of economic activity and a lot of revenue. I mean, just think about all these things. You've got all the professional spectator sports. You've got colleges, universities, and all of those programs and all of those sports. You know, are they going to open in the fall? That's a big question. And Jerry was spot on when he said, that's one of the main assumptions of our forecast. We need to see that come back because that stimulates a lot of economic activity. Then you have all the amusement parks and all the national parks. Now, Disneyland's not open. Universal's not open. Yosemite and Death Valley have opened up partially, so it's good to see that starting to come back. That will cater to tourism coming to California and getting that going, but it's still only baby steps at this point. We need theaters, performing arts, music festivals open. They are not. We're not likely to see summer festivals this year or parades. Those generate lots of economic activity. Conventions, conferences, more travel. This is all a drag on the recovery and causes longer term impacts for California, okay? You talked about the PPP loans earlier and you were asking about them. These were the primary recipient industries for the first round of the Paycheck Protection loans. Notice construction, professional, technical, scientific, manufacturing, and healthcare. Those were the principal recipients of those loans to restore employees by, paying them money during the shelter in place. Notice that accommodation, food service, retail trade, a lot less. And yet when we look to see who was impacted, it's those that received the Paycheck Protection loans that were less impacted by the shutdown. And I'll show you a picture of that in a second. California is the largest tourism state in the country. We have more hotels, bars, restaurants, wineries, breweries. We have more national parks. We have more theme parks. We have more amusement parks, more than any other state. We have more conferences here, more conventions here, more professional sports teams are located here, more year-round concerts, more performances, more wine tasting tourism than any place else. And then we have the most significant ports as well. And we've got more workers idled at the ports. So California was disproportionately impacted, and it's being disproportionately impacted right now. I can't emphasize that enough. Here are the principal industries which are not being as impacted as others. The top four that received the Paycheck Protection loans: construction, technology, manufacturing, healthcare. It's good to see that those aren't as impacted as the other sectors. However, the other sectors is where most of your minorities and small businesses are. And so that is going to be hard to overcome. We know a lot of those people have been let go. Those are the people we need to get back. And so perhaps new fiscal stimulus, new fiscal programs to help that particular demographic is going to be needed going forward. Construction is a big one, though. We've got a lot of minorities and a lot of lower paying workers and even a lot of undocumented workers in the construction industry, which has come back strong. And remember, construction was a huge engine of growth for the California economy. For the last several years, we had all-time record highs in investment dollars going into commercial and industrial structures in 2019, 2018, and 2020 was on track to do the exact same thing. So this was a major engine of growth. And the major construction regions was LA County with all the housing, office, hotel, and infrastructure projects. San Francisco and Santa Clara, tons of housing, office, and hotel were going in. There was a renaissance in these things. In Sacramento, lots of housing, more housing than in probably any other industry. In Butte County, we have all the fire rebuilds. And so that was completely inundated with construction workers. And then in Fresno and Kern and Madera, we've got the high-speed rail project, which has more people working on that than in any other time since it started. So this is the construction engine that we need to restore in order to get the regional economies going again. Furthermore, we have the Prop 53 projects for all the schools and school rehabilitation. and all those monies and the SB1 infrastructure projects. And so we have had a shortage of construction workers for years now. And so getting this particular industry back, it has been so important. And we saw the biggest surge of construction workers come back in May. It was so good to see the governor restore construction on April 28th and make all construction now essential. Here is job growth by region. The blue bars are how we declined from February to April. It was devastation. Look at those percentage declines, huge. And that's for Orange County, San Francisco, San Mateo, the San Francisco metro area, LA County. Okay, and then there is Sacramento. Now the yellow is then the recovery during May when things started to open up. So you can see very little recovery, but at least there is a recovery going on. And Sacramento had the biggest impact. Note in Fresno, it didn't really go down that much. Fresno is principally a farm county and not much recovery in April at all. But the farm counties seem to have not had their unemployment rates rise as much as other counties. Here's the change in unemployment rates between May of last year and May of this year. So again, if you have a real big change, that means you were really impacted by the shelter in place, by the shutdowns. And the number one county impacted, Los Angeles, okay? San Diego, Napa, Orange, Monterey. These were the top ones impacted. What do they have in common? Coastal, tourism oriented. Okay, that's why. So again, this is where policy needs to be directed, particularly towards this leisure and hospitality and retail group. The farm counties, Merced, Fresno, Kings, Butte, Madera, I mean, they weren't impacted as much. Farm was deemed essential, although we did see varying degrees of farm workers that were unemployed. In Fresno, hardly anything. However, in Monterey, we had big numbers of farm workers unemployed. And farm workers is another big category of minority workers and of undocumented workers. And we're likely, however, to see this all come back strong. Notice that the last two, Santa Clara and Marin, Jerry talked about this, technology was a strength and it's going to be offsetting of the tourism losses. But Marin and Santa Clara, those are the principal counties where technology workers live. And so the unemployment rates didn't rise as much in the tech concentrated industry. San Francisco is a mix between tech and tourism. And so that's kind of why it ended up in the middle. Talk about the Bay Area economy, most aggressive region in the nation in terms of shutting down the economy. We lost 600,000 jobs between March and April. Okay, and 48,000 have been restored in May. Proportionately more, however, were restored in Los Angeles and Orange counties. Why? Because they opened up, and so they could restore them. But the Bay Area didn't really open up in May. Sonoma, Napa suffered very high rates of unemployment because they were largely tourism that was shut down entirely, and wineries couldn't open at all. And then we've had professional and construction jobs largely spared in the Bay Area, and construction is coming back big time. Technology sectors have been relatively low, relatively low job loss, as Jerry talked about as well. And the LA County economy, which has the highest increase in unemployment and has an unemployment rate of over 20% right now. We've got a greater percentage of people that live there that are out of work than any other county. And workers unable to work remotely are in services, particularly tourism services. And there's more of these in the Los Angeles region than in other places. We got more tourism services. We have more entertainment services. The Dodgers, the Clippers, the Lakers are there. Those are big and they employ lots of people and all the ancillary industries that support them. You got Universal Studios, Magic Mountain, all the Hollywood infrastructure, all the museums, the beaches, Santa Monica Pier, the Promenade, all the film studios, everything shut down. It really hit LA badly this time. And then, of course, the ports of LA and Long Beach idled because of so many fewer vessel calls that have come in. And that's starting to be restored, but it's still just a fraction of where it was. And then you have more self-employed small business workers in the greater LA area, which have been unemployed. Here's hotel motel occupancy rates in Los Angeles County. And you can see monthly is when we used to track them. It was running around 80%. 80% on a constant basis. Okay, and then we were able to track occupancy daily from March 1st on, because that's where they were able to report. So this is where the lockdowns came in place. This is where the travel bans came in right here. And then the shelter in place was called on March 13th in the Bay Area, or 15th, and then March 19th in Southern California. And you can see occupancy rates declining all the way down to 20% in LA. They're being restored, but they're still very low. So the comeback is very austere. Here's the San Francisco Bay Area. Okay, 80% again, just like LA. Here's where we are today, 30%. Not much improvement. We need to see travel restored. Okay, we need to see those many people in these low-paying industries get back to work. Otherwise, this is going to cause for a long-term problematic, systematic unemployment in the California economy. Here's flights coming into San Francisco International Airport. Travel bans were put in place here, both for Asia and Europe. Shelter in place. And then flights have gone from 1,250 a day inbound and outbound all the way down to about 200. That's where we are today. So travel's not coming back. And this was as of Monday of this week. So how do we recover? And then this will be my last sort of point of my presentation. How will it go? Here's how we think. You can choose a letter of the alphabet, V-shaped recovery, which is a rapid recovery, but we're not likely to get that because we have limitations on capacity. We have limitations on social distancing. We have phased openings, and we don't have the phase 3 opening yet, large public events. It's only in the early parts. And then you can have a W, a U, an L. You know, I'm going to dismiss this. What we're likely to see is, and I'm in the same camp as Nickelsburg. So you grow. This was March of 2020. We went straight down. This could be anything. This could be employment. It could be output. It could be income. It could be whatever economic indicator you choose. And to get back up to the pre-crisis level, it's going to be a long process, at least a couple of years. And then we'll be in a new economic expansion. Now, it doesn't go that smooth. Of course, it goes with fits and starts. But nevertheless, you get the point that we're in this for a while. The next 2 to 3 years, we are still trying to work out of the ditch that we're in. And it's because we've got too much carnage that has occurred over time. The unemployment rate will remain high. Here's where we are now. That's where we are. Second quarter this year. And you can see that it improves over time as the economy opens, things get back, but it takes a long time for unemployment to get back down to where it was. And even after the end of a couple of years, we're still not where we were in February of this year. Okay, long-term implications. Automobiles and home sales are not likely to be as impacted going forward. Expect to see some supply chains, as Jerry talked about, move back to the US, especially from China, because we want to rely more on a resilient US and California economy rather than an efficient one. We want to be able to have those functions here within our control. However, if we see more supply chains come back, we're likely to see more business out migration from California, because if we're going to be bringing manufacturing back, it likely won't be in California. It'll be in other parts of the country. And a lot of the corporations that are here will want to consolidate on site with their manufacturing processes. It could take up to 2 years to restore consumer confidence in airline travel. Jerry talked about that. There will be more work performed at home in the immediate future. We already know that. It's already happening. It's a big issue. However, it's uncertain whether this is actually going to translate into a significant trend for office using firms. Okay, this is one of these best laid plans things. Yeah, we're going to have you work from home, but down the road, we may find out we really do need you in the office. We need the social networking. We need the team building. We need to have you on site. So we'll see how that goes. It's uncertain whether companies will downsize space requirements as a result. Don't know. Right now, they're going to need social distancing. So that works for more space, but then they can keep certain people at home. That works for less space. Maybe an offset wash. There may be conversions of hotels because they just will not be able to sustain the delays in getting customers back. And so they may sell out to, housing developers that could be turned into multifamily housing or into office space. Okay, and there will be increased purchasing of goods online, probably continuing to go forward. And that will result in perhaps a collapse of retail stores and malls and retail rents. So it's going to be interesting to see how the dominoes fall down the line with the retail apocalypse that we're in right now, and that will likely be exacerbated by what we're seeing today with much more online purchasing. There'll be fewer retail stores, fewer jobs in retail to come back to by laid off workers. There'll be more industrial warehouses. That's the new retail now. Okay, the new fulfillment centers. They'll need to accommodate the inventories of retail goods that are ordered online. So those areas that have a lot of that infrastructure in place, like the Central California counties, in Fresno and Stanislaus and San Joaquin and Kern County, Inland Empire, lots of fulfillment centers, lots of warehousing. Those are likely to do well and create lots of jobs. Apartment vacancy will rise this year because you may have read in the Chronicle, a lot of the Generation Zers are moving back with their parents. Yes, they're getting forbearance from their landlords, but they don't want to incur the arrearage. So they're going back home with their parents. That's causing a spike in vacancy rates in apartments in the Bay Area. We are starting to see some indications of that later. However, we believe that will change once people start getting back to work, and it will recover in tandem with the economy. That was basically my comments. I can take questions now, but if you want continued updates that we do on a regular basis, visit my website, californiaforecast.com, and we put out updates on how the economy is doing, probably a couple times a week, and we calculate the weekly real-time unemployment rate.
Mark, this is Pedro Nava. So I'm wondering, are you available to stay during Mr. Klowden's presentation? Because Mr. Klowden has to leave at 12.
Oh, sure, I'll be around. And we can ask questions, and you can do questions then.
I appreciate that very much. So Ethan, if you can please introduce Mr. Klowden, and I apologize to the commissioners for interrupting that way, but I don't want us to be in a situation where we don't hear from Mr. Klowden.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think, Dr. Schniepp, I think your screen share is still on. If you can
sure,
turn that off, that would be great. Thank you very much. So, commissioners, we do have one other witness, and then we'll have time for questions. Kevin Klowden is Executive Director of the Center for Regional Economics and the California Center at the Milken Institute. He specializes in the study of key factors that underlie the development of competitive regional economies, such as clusters of innovation, concentration of skilled labor, and how these are influenced by public policy, and in turn, how they influence regional economies. Mr. Klowden.
Greetings, and thank you very much, Ethan. Appreciate it, and thank you very much to commissioners for a chance to talk. I am operating with a slightly different environment, and actually realizing that I may switch off of this background as much as I left it for a prior speech because I thought it was nice and dramatic. But if people are having trouble seeing me, let me know. I'm operating from a slightly different perspective, is that I'm not a forecaster, rather I'm an individual who is, I deal with long-term issues in terms of regional economic development. And I'm going to be speaking today from a perspective of issues in relation to capital access, small business, long-term prospects for a number of businesses in different sectors, and particularly focusing on areas of long-term prospects for regional economic development and what I view as some of the key underlying issues behind that. The major concern we're facing right now in this pandemic has been brought up by the previous two speakers in terms of this is not a V-shaped recovery. It cannot be a V-shaped recovery. And I want to contextualize things right now in terms of making it clear the longer term prospects of this recovery is that we are not out of the first wave of the pandemic. One of the things that the Milken Institute does is that we, as a nonpartisan, nonprofit economic think tank, I focus particularly on the issues of job creation, access to capital, but we have a whole section focused on health, including our Faster Cures group, which is especially focused on the prospects of vaccines and when they're going to arrive, as well as longer health issues. Right now, we are seeing a resurgence in the numbers in California. It's one of more than a dozen states that are seeing rises in the number of cases. California, in fact, just passed up our April record for the most cases reported in a day. Right now, LA County is in particular vulnerable. Sacramento County is vulnerable. We're seeing a number of different counties around the state that are showing real signs of increases. The one piece of good news for LA County is that the hospitalization rate has not been rising. This may be due to access of more widespread testing than we saw in April and the ability to potentially catch cases earlier and for people to self-quarantine or seek treatment at an earlier basis as opposed to doing it in a more crisis-oriented mode. But we are seeing significant rises in hospitalizations in the LA suburbs, namely Ventura County, Riverside County, San Bernardino County, and Orange County. We are also seeing a real impact that is being driven where gatherings in large indoor gatherings, particularly ones that came out of graduations, various large family gatherings, parties, and groups where people are dramatically less likely to follow social distancing and mask wearing rules when in private, have been helping to drive a significant increase in cases. And the fact is that whether it happens in a couple weeks or it happens in a few months in a second wave, an additional round of lockdown, to whatever degree it's going to happen, is extremely likely in California. It's even more likely in states such as Arizona, Florida, Texas. Texas just proceeded to slow down its reopening plans, but there's a real concern about the amount of political will necessary to actually enact that. The reason this is important and to keep in mind is that as the US reopens, it, as mentioned previously, raises a specter both of Americans being able to travel overseas for tourism, foreigners being able to come to the US for tourism, and Americans moving around the country for tourism, as well as other kinds of business travel, engagement, and otherwise. The major concern that we are dealing with right now is the fact that California and small businesses are particularly running short in terms of capital. Structurally, the tourism industry is unlikely to recover in any reasonable degree until early next year. There are already delays in place where Disneyland had originally been planning to open middle of next month, primarily focusing on local tourism and intra-US tourism because of a significant amount of pushback from their labor unions, as well as rising COVID rates in Orange County. That's now been delayed. And Disney has said they will not announce what their new deadline and timeline is until after July 4th. Knott's Berry Farm has already said they will not reopen this year. And there are a number of other potential restrictions going on. In terms of longer term prospects, construction, which has been a real boon, especially with different kinds of office projects and major construction elements that were resumed early, has a limited ability to have a long-term benefit for the recovery. It's worth keeping in mind that there are a couple issues that are going on in terms of the structures of construction. First, the office market is fundamentally needing to transform and change itself. A number of the major drivers, flex office space, places such as WeWork, various competitors, a number of different corporations that were actively moving into larger centers within the urban areas to attract people, will now have to look at their long-term demands and their needs for office space, especially as the longer-term prospects for COVID-19 remain dim for the next several months. Prospects for a virus are extremely unlikely to be able to not only be validated and approved, but also go into full production before the end of this year. It's worth remembering that even that is a tremendously accelerated timetable we are operating under. The federal government and manufacturers are prioritizing this to an incredible degree. It used to take at best 4 years for the approval of a vaccine. We are now looking still at an approval of a vaccine in a year to 18 months, but a year to 18 months is still a considerable length of time. That means that because of the data linking virus transmission to enclosed office spaces, that a lot of white collar operations will remain in at least partial remote operation for a considerable length of time. Also, the other issue that particularly was driving a lot of the retail pressure in California, especially in the coastal areas, was a tremendous boom period of ultra low interest rates that came out of the period leading up to the Great Recession and afterwards. That bubble that essentially has been operating has caused a tremendous increase in valuation, significant resale of assets that involves various retail levels to real estate investment trusts, various other vehicles for lending and investing. That is going to fall under a significant level of constraint going forward. A number of commercial real estate investment properties are being viewed as capital constrained in a way that they were not leading up to this point. There's, with the tremendous pressure that's going on in terms of retail, one would expect that there will be a decline in the valuations for a number of properties that already should have been marked down leading up to the pandemic. This will only be exacerbated. What will wind up happening is that the main sustaining element right now that is going on in terms of retail has been the move to being able to do online or phone orders for pickup. That there are a number of people polled consistently who have stated that that is something that they strongly prefer. They still prefer having the human interaction, being able to identify and be able to handle the goods to some degree, even if they can't do a return before they bring a product back. And that, especially for small and mid-sized businesses and for a certain number of various mall operators, is going to be essential for sustaining this. Data is showing that because of the stimulus money that has been going forward in terms of unemployment benefits, both at the state and federal level, that as long as that continues, that working class and middle class individuals are still spending a tremendous amount of money on purchases, even though they've been paying down debt, even though the savings rate in the United States has hit its highest level in decades. There is still a consistent ongoing demand. The falling demand, which is affecting, and where it will continue to affect California, is in high-end retail and high-end purchases. The wealthy who are able to essentially sequester themselves and to put off purchases have been doing so at a record rate. And for a lot of the higher end retail, that's going to be an increasing source of pressure. And it's also going to affect higher end service jobs, a number of the malls and various other retail operations that have been set up to cater to the wealthy. And there is a real question as to how that sector will sustain, especially since that had received the largest amount of investment in terms of retail over the last few years and was core to a lot of retail investment strategies.
Can I interrupt there?
Sure, please.
So I have been exposed recently to some polling data and by reputable pollsters. Effectively, what they found reinforces your point. That is, according to a 1,000-person online survey, 32% of people surveyed said they would not return to their previous economic life until there's a vaccine. And that group skews older, liberal, and wealthy. It completely ratifies, I think, what you're saying. And it's the remaining number of people, there's a certain percentage who are actively interested in reopening, less concerned about their personal health or their public health. But there's a group in the middle who are uncertain about health prognosis. And they're very dependent on being, frankly, led to a conclusion, including by businesses, that they're doing something beyond the norm. That is, if there's a mask requirement in a county, they'll do that, and the retail provider will do that. That stimulates confidence by consumers. Distancing within a facility, outdoor dining, all the remaining things. But you're not going to influence that 32% no matter what you do until there's a vaccine. And as you suggest, and I think you're right, the fastest vaccine in history is 4 years. So it does suggest a very large anchor on the economy, making the previous witnesses jagged edge, sort of like a Nike swoosh economy, probably right, but the time frame may be longer than 2 years. I assume you agree with that.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that if you look at a lot of the, obviously there's an external voice that agrees as well and is quite enthusiastic. The larger issue that you're also running into with that in this longer term recovery is the number of small businesses that have already been essentially had to declare themselves out of business in order to avoid legacy costs and structures, particularly in the African American and Latina markets. That has been the data on African American businesses is running between 40 and 50% of businesses which have already shut down in terms of smaller businesses. We're seeing that in a whole variety of different sectors. In some of that was because of delays in getting PPE funds. Actually, one of the things we at the Institute and a couple of my colleagues have been particularly focused on was trying to redress that issue, but even redressing the issue of getting capital to minority businesses will not structurally solve a number of these issues over the longer term, and you're going to have to see a number of adaptations. It is also worth keeping in mind in terms of the data and in terms of the people going back to work, that there is a significant class of people who are among the most vulnerable, who are people who have no choice but to return to work. That they are in situations where they are either in essential employment, they are aware of any unemployment either running out or being conditional on their business not operating. In terms of retail, there is a second side to that, which is incredibly important, which is that when you deal with customers coming in to shop, a customer who fails to wear a mask is at a relatively low risk when shopping in that store, especially if there's any provisions for social distancing, especially if there's been any setup to protect the customer, where the employees are wearing masks and gloves, but the employees themselves are dramatically at higher risk. And so what we're seeing in terms of data and ongoing issues, what we're seeing whether in various factories, the meatpacking factories being the most notorious around the country. But for example, we saw in the Tesla plant where the Tesla factory opened up early and its provisions for protecting workers were not enough in order to isolate and track and protect people who were likely infected, is that it raises issues of broader scale infections. One of the things that's been very important when talking about the entertainment industry, and that's an industry I've spent a lot of time engaging with over the years and talking with various people at different levels, is that the reopening of the entertainment industry is ultimately going to function based on making productions operate within a contained bubble. A lot of the conditions for reopening the entertainment industry were actually set by the labor unions. They were set for the sake of protecting people, because what most individuals outside of entertainment productions fail to think about or understand is that it's not simply the people on camera who are at risk. It's really the people who are all clustered in a small circle, holding up microphones, manning electronics, manning cameras, providing various support services, who have to operate in incredibly close proximity to each other, let alone the actors. And being able to operate productions in a bubble, essentially, where people are extremely limited in their outside exposure and are basically being treated as an extended family, is ultimately the only way to sustain productions. We are going to see in entertainment productions the same issue that we're seeing in professional sports, where attempts to operate in a bubble and to provide content for an audience is only going to work as long as the entire staff, so to speak, connected with that production is protected. And if efforts are made to test, trace, and isolate both individuals in the production and potentially the production as a whole, depending on the circumstances. And we're going to see cyclical natures of this in entertainment, and how well the productions are able to protect their workers and themselves will have a huge impact on whether or not entertainment productions are able to continue and particularly operate in California. And it's worth remembering that a number of the states that have been the most aggressive at luring productions outside of California, not coincidentally, also happen to be the ones with some of the lowest levels of mandated protections, such as Georgia. And that is also going to make people be very clear and considerate about whether or not productions move elsewhere, whether or not they stay here, and whether or not they're able to continue. And this is not just in the US, by the way. This is moving productions to Eastern Europe. This is moving productions to Asia or Australia or wherever else. And New Zealand, which had done a tremendous job of luring productions in, is because of the nature of their lockdown strategy, which has been incredibly effective, as they reopen, is going to be extremely careful about how they allow people to come in for productions, quarantine, and then essentially stay there and operate there over a longer term basis. This could create bubbles of productions that locate elsewhere outside of California. It could, there's going to be a number of reassessments. It is helping, by the way, in the interim, a lot of short form productions in various companies, including those based in California, who cater to both user-generated content and smaller focused content as well.
Yeah, Mr. Klowden, I just want to, if anybody reads Variety, there's been a number of articles over the last few editions all about what you're talking about. But I want to turn to Commissioner Buisa, because I understand she has to leave at 12 as well, and she has a question, and I don't want to lose your opportunity to do that.
Okay, absolutely.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Commissioner Nava. My question is actually for Mark, and it has to do with what we already know as the correlation between decisive leadership, political will, behavioral modification, and consumer anxiety in terms of beginning to address some of the recommendations and the findings that you had in your presentation. The question that I have is there any value, or are you even thinking of looking at models from other countries that have successfully, or at least are beginning to successfully contain the impacts of the pandemic. Like, I'm thinking like New Zealand, Japan, even Germany, and like overlay that model here. Because the data that the three of you have presented is so stark. It feels it's almost impossible to grapple with the complexity of it without looking at models that could help us stage things, face things, and really will help this commission, as well as the governor's recovery team, in thinking very, very broadly about what we could do moving forward.
Right. And it's interesting that you ask about other countries and what are they doing. And we have looked quite extensively at China because that gives us the longest sample period in which they've essentially been out of the woods, or at least that they allege that they're out of the woods. And we can look at their economy and see how it's coming back. And so as part of my longer presentations, I do put in a segment that has us look at China and what's going on there, because that gives us implications for how things will evolve here. And we're also looking at Sweden, which never closed, although, as you probably rightly know, they've had a relapse. But New Zealand, Singapore, those are all contained. Australia, and we are seeing containment in Spain and Germany and many of the European countries, which have had national shutdowns, and they didn't allow for, counties or provinces within those countries to dictate, when something would open and when something would not. It was sort of a nationalistic rule. So we can look to Germany. That really hasn't opened up. We don't have enough data there yet. And so we'll be doing that as we move forward to see where the successes are occurring. In China, where we have, again, the most data, they're doing okay, but they have not overcome the fear factor on the part of many consumers. So there's still a lot of hesitation to go to restaurants. And they don't have a lot of fun activity occurring. Disneyland is open in Shanghai. It's been open since March, but they only have 25% capacities and they're never, overcrowded. I think that there's still an austerity in demand for these things. I think people are still afraid of the virus catching it because it had such a devastating effect on them in January. So, and we're seeing, of course, that it can be similar here. So we're watching China. We're looking at, the larger countries as they come out of this, and I'll be able to report more on that if I have a chance to talk to you again.
Thank you. Do we have any, did we interrupt you, Mr. Klowden? Did you still have?
Yeah, I actually had a couple other things. I about several more minutes of material. So one of the things that I actually wanted to focus on in particular, and I know dealing with time constraints that I want to make point of bringing up, is the issue of the structural recovery long-term around different parts of California, and the fact that right now, one of the major issues that's going to happen in terms of the economies in different parts of the state is going to be an ability to adapt to a longer-term remote work environment, and a structural ability to adapt to attracting and retaining different kinds of businesses with a structural support for those, including telework, remote centers of operation, and otherwise. One of the major things that's been particularly true in terms of Silicon Valley, that has been a trend that has been going on for quite some time, has been the remote location of centers of operation for different companies. Google has in many ways led this trend in terms of setting up operations not only in the city of San Francisco, where people expressly wanted to live in San Francisco, not in Mountain View and the surrounding area, but also in a number of other parts around the country, both higher costs such as New York, relatively lower costs such as Pittsburgh and elsewhere. But there has been a very consistent trend for Google, There's been a consistent trend for Intel, who in many ways led the way in terms of moving and expanding operations outside of California, where they employ more people up in Hillsboro, Oregon, and Mesa, Arizona than they do in California. And that is the ability to attract and retain talent. The issue that California is facing right now is that there is a need, as has been mentioned, with advanced manufacturing to be able to match talent, particularly at the community college level for the entry-level manufacturing and technical training, and being able to provide that training for these manufacturers, especially since in California, the large bulk manufacturers have very much given way in a trend that dates back to the late 80s, early 90s, to smaller specialized advanced manufacturers. LA County remains the largest manufacturing county in the country. And this ability to attract and retain these advanced manufacturers is dependent on having workers who are trained either in 2-year applied programs or very often in 4-year programs where they are ready to work. Some of the major constraints that have happened in California in terms of attracting and retaining workers, looking at Silicon Valley in particular, but in being incredibly important for any efforts to relocate workers, whether it is in advanced manufacturing and reshoring, or it is in any kind of technical support or various service-based efforts relating to Silicon Valley, online content and otherwise, is the ability to attract and retain and place workers locally rather than trying to bring them in outside of California. California, with the exception of the lead up of the tech bubble and some periods, short periods coming out of the Great Recession, has consistently had domestic outmigration. And this has been particularly true in the last few years of unskilled workers, but it is also true of skilled workers, particularly who have families and want to buy houses. The ability of those workers to be able to stay in California, especially in places that they consider to be relatively desirable, that are not in the large city centers, is incredibly important. The constraints on this right now are particularly apparent because the proposed budget compromise that is in place, provided that there is federal aid, will retain funding for K-12 education and community colleges. The community colleges are incredibly important in this regard. K-12 education obviously is a big deal, but there are other fundamental issues with K-12 education, and I'll touch on the child care issue that was brought up earlier in just a moment. And that is that to get the applied skills, you also need applied training at the Cal States. You need partnership with businesses. The Cal States have fundamentally drifted away from their prior mandate towards training people for jobs. Originally, a lot of that was around training people to be teachers, but a huge amount of it was also training people to go directly into the workforce. The Cal Polys are running at capacity. There has not been a new Cal Poly campus added since the 1950s. The San Jose State University, to a large extent, and to a lesser extent, Cal State Long Beach and a couple others have been adapting themselves to help fill that void, but that need remains. And that need, especially in facing the future of having not high-level skilled grad student degrees, but 2- and 4-year degrees that can face both this demand and local facilitation of manufacturing and being able to match it up, where local metropolitan areas, say such as Fresno or Bakersfield, that are viewed as being lower levels of restrictions in terms of being able to build factories or develop, have a major problem in terms they don't have the local talent pools, in terms of where the Cal States are not particularly aligned towards the new businesses, with the exception of Fresno and some water technology efforts, and where they are dependent on bringing people in or having them educated elsewhere in the state, which is sometimes a cost and space constraint. And matching that demand is going to be incredibly important coming out of the recession. And as the economy recovers, where far more people will be working remotely, where the manufacturing that comes back is going to employ fewer people at a higher skill level, and where a number of the more traditional service jobs will have to be adapted. And if we do not have a mechanism in place to adapt, and this is going to be a constraint on long-term economic recovery and growth for California. The other thing I alluded to and I want to mention, because it was brought up earlier, and it's something I actually wrote a piece on a bit over a week ago on LinkedIn, and I consider to be incredibly important, is that the child care issue, it's worth noting, is a constraint even if the schools open back up, especially if the schools open back up for children who are 6 years old and under. A number of the providers already have gone under. Their estimates, as many as 50% of those providers are gone and would need additional funding and support, especially to be able to adapt to a social distancing environment, which they are not able to do. Further, there is a significant problem, whereas was mentioned by one of the board members earlier, that there is a huge distortion, particularly for women and minorities, where they have a much greater need for that, where particularly in the Latina community, a certain amount of that has come from extended relatives. But as that community, then demographics have evolved, and as people have moved around, that is less available. The fact is also that you have a major assumption that schools are going to reopen in a full-time capacity around the state. Right now, I can say that that is unlikely. That unless there is a virus suddenly, a vaccine magically happening, or there is no resurgence of the virus coming in any time after this current temporal spike that's happening over the summer, that when there is a resurgence of the virus, which has been predicted repeatedly, that will happen in the fall or winter, that ultimately schools will not be able to operate in a traditional capacity, that the guidelines that exist right now that were issued by the governor's office, as they've been interpreted, do not lend themselves to full-time operation, especially given the constraints that will happen in terms of the high number of students who are currently intended to be in classrooms, the fact that in urban environments, the ones that are most likely to be vulnerable to the virus, where the number of students is significantly higher than it is in suburban and more rural environments, the schools will not be able to operate in a way to provide what is viewed as that long-term childcare or childcare alternative. And the need for investment in broadband, particularly hitting poor families, the need to be able to create centers of distance learning and childcare where people can attend school remotely and the parents can still go back to work is going to be incredibly important. Otherwise, we are going to see a massive constraint on the return to work of women and families of color.
Thank you very much. I know we're coming up against 12 o'clock. Any questions, comments by commissioners? And remember, we still have Mr. Schniepp available. Thank you, Mark, for hanging on. It looks like Commissioner Aroner.
I just wanted to ask Kevin if he could share the piece that he did on childcare with us.
I absolutely can. What I can do is I will email it to Ethan.
We will distribute it. Yeah, we will distribute it.
Thank you.
I'll make sure of that.
Great.
I see Mr. Byers unmuted.
Sure. It's a general question. Is there any reason to believe that the consequence of COVID-19 and the pandemic isn't going to produce a substantially more unequal income distribution unless public policy changes substantially?
You're absolutely right. It is going to. If you're looking at it in terms of the effects, health outcomes, the fact that poor members of the community are more likely to wait longer to get care because they are not, even if mandates have said that direct virus care is supposed to be free in theory or paid for, It doesn't mean that people necessarily trust it or feel that they can go to the doctors or that they can afford to go to stay off work. There are real issues in terms of long-term potential effects on people's organs if they received a severe amount of care. The lack of sustainability of small, mid-sized businesses, a number of them, it's going to disproportionately affect poorer parts of the community. And it's also, and another significant issue that's going to happen is that, which has not really been studied heavily yet, but there are some pieces out there that speculate, and that is that a significant number of people for whom going to college was always a more marginal proposition are going to be unlikely to resume college afterwards. In the prior recession, we saw a significant spike in people going to college or graduate school while they were laid off. It is because of the space constraints, because of the lack of in-person options, because of more significant imbalances in unemployment and the economic consequences. There's a lot of speculation that you will see far more people whose education was disrupted when the school shut down and will not be able to resume, that they will not have the means to do so. And the data isn't there yet, obviously, because we haven't seen the reopenings. We're not in the fall semester quarter, but there is a lot of speculation that will also create significant long-term outcomes if we do not make an effort to address it from a policy standpoint. And we are not extremely aware of the fact that there will be more people who are already marginal in paying for college who will not be able to continue it.
Yeah, Mr. Schniepp, you want to add anything to that?
Well, Kevin's right when he said the imbalance in the unemployment rates, and given the fact that our forecast, UCLA's and ours, has leisure, hospitality, retail, some of these lower average salary industries coming back much later in the game. I mean, they're going to take the longest to recover. That just opens up the income gap between, wealthy and moderate or even poor income groups. So yes, without some policy interjection, look to see this gap continuing to widen.
Commissioner Arender?
Yeah, so on another topic, because none of you have mentioned it except for the fast train, in the valley. Transportation's we've seen significant changes in our transportation patterns during the pandemic. Fewer people are on the road, fewer people are using public transportation. I mean, buses and Caltrain and stuff like that in the Bay Area and whatever it is in Southern California. And with more and more people working at home, and your presumption that a lot of that's going to continue, at least for a significant period of time. What do you see? I mean, this all relates to climate change, right? We've all remarked about the air being much cleaner in the Bay Area. People in LA talk about the air being much cleaner down in LA. How do you see the transportation sector, right, changing, coming back, reversing itself? I don't know what the terms are, given the effects of the pandemic.
And can I just make one interjection, because I know I have to drop off? And it's just, the first thing is just from a metropolitan area, the biggest issue you're going to see is a massive fiscal impact and constraint on the mass transit systems in the cities. We already saw a major blow that happened to their models when Governor Brown authorized driver's license for illegal immigrants, because it took what was essentially a captive audience off of the system, especially since there was a strong need for a number of illegal immigrants to have their own vehicles because they were doing more spot work and off the books work, which required more travel. You are going to see a positive impact in terms of climate change locally. The problem is with climate change, I just want to be aware of this, is that by far the largest polluter globally now is China. It's actually taken over from the US in a lot of ways. It's going to help the US output, but we saw a major spike in Chinese output of CO2 and related gases as their factories built back up. And it's worth remembering that as reshoring happens, if it happens to places such as Vietnam or South Asia, that you still have the transportation issue. You still have the fact that they don't have the same constraints on air quality that we see here. Any manufacturing and anything that moves here is going to help that, even if it goes to Canada or Mexico, especially under the new USMCA terms, which is now going into effect. That's going to matter. But for right now, for transportation, the major constraint you're going to run into is that the local systems are going to have to adapt. They're going to have to reduce supply, create a balance between a reduced supply, social distancing, and otherwise. And that's something we've been seeing New York and London and other places in leading the way and trying to create that balance. And it's going to be incredibly important. It is, however, I think going to affect the auto industry, not just repairs, but overall demand going forward, because people will not use their vehicles as much over the next couple of years, which means they will not wear through them as quickly. You're not going to run into the same overall demand. It is going to be an opportunity, though, that you are in a number of projections have said this, that when people go and buy new vehicles, they will be more positively inclined towards buying a cleaner vehicle, especially in California. The main constraint that we're going to see, however, is what happens to oil prices, because oil prices have always had a huge impact on what consumers buy, even in California, no matter what they say. So thank you, everyone. I apologize that I have to drop off, but and I will make sure to email my piece on my LinkedIn piece. And if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to email me. I'll be happy to answer them or at another time.
Thank you, Mr. Klowden. Any other commissioners?
I have a question.
Yes, please. I see you, Jenna.
Yeah, okay. So it appears from what we're hearing that what we need is some jobs work program of some sort, jobs training, and some policy to address that. What is not clear to me is, what are we training for? And so I would certainly like to hear some your thoughts on, is it some sort of IT? Is it, what is it that we might suggest jobs training to do to help with all of these changes that we're talking about seeing? We may not need as many bus drivers. We may not need the same type of manufacturing. But so I'm just curious of your thoughts about, how we can help get out of this conundrum that we now are in.
Right, and it's going to take a while for us to do that. But again, as part of the main themes of my presentation is the longer that we delay, a rapid recovery, then the more onerous this becomes over time, and we lose these jobs sort of permanently. At least we lose more of them. So to the extent that we can get things going, then we won't have this problem. But you're right, we have a retraining issue that we're going to have to address. Now, in February of this year, we had essentially a shortage of workers. We had more jobs that were unfilled than we had workers to fill them. And again, this was a regional issue too, but mostly in the Bay Area, you had significantly greater job openings than you did have people even to fill them. So this is definitely has changed. It's completely now gone opposite. Now you've got tons of workers. But as the economy ramps up, you will get this match back. You just won't see the leisure, the food services, the recreation, those industries being able to absorb all their old employees back. And so this is where the retraining efforts are going to have to come into effect. And did you said IT? IT is in big demand. In fact, if there was any industry that had more job openings unfilled, it is IT. It's software, it's in the high-tech firms, it's in that capacity. And that will continue to be the case going forward. So to the extent that retraining efforts can be directed into the community colleges towards IP-specific types of skills, then yes, that would be a very successful policy to be able to implement.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schniepp. Do we have, let me see if I see no other microphones open. Although I would have thought that Commissioner Varner would have latched on to the issue with respect to community colleges and rural counties, the affordability of land and the ability to perhaps introduce manufacturing in those kinds of places, like Riverside, like San Bernardino, like the Inland Empire.
Yeah, I don't need to say anything because you know exactly what I was thinking. But I have an interesting comment, something that I thought about while the speakers were speaking. I don't know, something probably for staff to maybe explore. You know, we've had these PPP loans for the businesses, and we've talked about in previous studies about the future of work and the retraining the workforce. Perhaps there's a program that we could look at that would be similar, where a student loan program for the retraining, that it would provide a living wage, and the retraining program for a limited time would be a student loan that's forgivable if they complete the program and find work after that.
We can certainly we can explore that as we continue to do research on this general topic. So we will add that to the list.
Well, I think I'm presupposing that at some point in time the state government's going to start looking at a living wage component. Based on the shutdown and some of these jobs that are not going to come back, and with the with some of this telecommuting and people not coming back into the office setting, I think that's going to have even an additional impact on the future of retail. Those retail entities that, like in Riverside, there's a lot of restaurants and retail that just rely on the workforce down here, and if it went to telecommuting, those couldn't survive. So if we do go to some sort of thought process where we're looking at a living wage, perhaps we can look at it more like a student loan program, where at least we're getting people incentivized to go into the retraining program.
Commissioner Byer?
Yeah, I just want to respond to Commissioner Varner a little bit, not to create a controversy, but just offer a perspective. If you look at the size of the US economy, $20 to $22 trillion, and we've already appropriated on the order of $4 trillion in spending, more is likely. The Federal Reserve has engaged in what some people call helicopter money. They put trillions of dollars of capital into play in terms of securing the bond market, the stock market, everything else. And yet the state government, local government are constrained and frankly need money. Going forward, I believe the challenge for the state government of California is going to be how to prioritize gigantic spending at a time when there's already a $54 billion shortfall, and the budget agreement frankly just postpones that. And so it's going to be choices about what to do in the short term versus medium long term. And we are not, unfortunately, going to have the luxury of doing all things the way we did 6 months ago. And so one of the bigger challenges is going to be for us in conducting these hearings is to think about what principles or priorities we think we should be paying attention to. Because there are many things, job training, supporting information technology, workforce, which are good ideas, but we have to decide whether we're in a situation from a public health point of view and from an economic point of view, where we're going to have to spend almost all the available money to sustain the public health components of responding to the crisis and less focus on long-term economic planning. And that's just a general comment, but I'm worried about where we are as a state in terms of the infection rate, et cetera. CDC came out this morning and said the infection rate is 10 times higher than the projected numbers, and that there are 23 million people infected in the United States. That's a stunning number. And if we end up with a meltdown approaching anything like New York in terms of hospitalizations and intensive care, hospitals will melt down and you'll end up with a lot of deaths. And so we as a state, I think, are going to have to deal with some really very difficult issues.
But this is Pedro, Commissioner Aaroner. Before I turn to you, I just wanted to say to Mr. Schniepp, thank you for your presentation. You're welcome to remain if you'd like to, but it looks to me as though commissioners are now getting into the conversation discussion part of the meeting. It's a public meeting, you can stay, but should you have other commitments, I think you need to know that you've been gracious enough to wait, and we appreciate that. But if you don't want to wait any longer, you're not required to do so.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thanks for the opportunity to address all of you today.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for coming. This has been great. Yeah.
Bye.
Commissioner Aaroner?
So following up on Commissioner Byers' remarks, which is, it certainly makes me think, I mean, we are in a particularly complicated time, right? More so than anything I can ever remember in my lifetime, in that we have three different things going on, right? We have an economic problem, to say the least, that was created by the pandemic. But at the same time, we have something else going on, which is what's going on in the streets, not only of California, but across the nation, and it appears across the world in regards to the inequities that people have decided finally need to be dealt with. And so it seems to me that at the time that we're looking at all of this issue of income inequality, which one of the speakers I think mentioned, in that we have workers here who have lost their jobs, who might never get their jobs back, particularly in those sectors that have been mentioned, the hospitality sector, that kind of thing, travel, and we have a need for workers of all things, and we've had this need for quite a while. We've been importing workers to do it, which means in our high-tech industries, right? Even though the current federal administration seems to not be interested in allowing anybody to come into the country under false pretenses, from my perspective. But the question becomes, when in this whole discussion of retraining and all of that, the people who are losing their jobs and might never get their jobs back, probably, if you looked at the educational ladder, right, are probably at the bottom of that ladder for the most part, because they might be, they're immigrants coming into this country looking for work in order to sustain themselves and their families back home, that kind of thing. And then the technical things that we need done in the tech industry, there's not a connection here, but we're identifying the connection as the education system, whether it be at community colleges, which have been a major force in all of that, but whether or not the timing, right, how long it would take the individuals that have lost their jobs in these particular areas, right, to get the education necessary to be able to fill the jobs in the tech industry. I just think we need to look at that to find it. We need to figure out what's realistic and what's not realistic. I don't know how else to say it. And then I thought the speaker was really alluding to the fact that when we looked at the state budget proposal, where the cuts are in higher education. They are at the UC system and they are at the state university system. And they will only be refilled if we get more money from the federal government. And I'm not criticizing the choices made by the legislature and the governor. That's not the issue here. It's just in regards to our conversation. How do we discuss and figure out how you find the workforce, deciding on what the needs are in the future workforce, and match those needs to the people who are currently losing their jobs in the current workforce, and whether or not we have a realistic proposal in order to figure out how to move them into where we have the job openings, that kind of thing. So I don't know, it's complicated.
Nope, I think that's an accurate assessment, and part of what staff is going to have to do as we pull this stuff together is I think that Little Hoover Commission for the longest time has been very practical in compiling recommendations. We're not doing blue sky stuff. We're looking at, okay, what are the moving parts? Who can make the contribution? And I think part of what we heard today very clearly was that this job market is going to change dramatically.
Yeah.
a lot of people aren't coming back, and a lot of the jobs that they had aren't going to be there for them.
Mhm.
So, you know, how do you, we talk so much about getting the private sector involved with education in order to sort of figure out where the new jobs are going to be and how we move people into that. And this once again is a reemphasis of that I don't think that partnership is ever developed well enough. There may be pockets where it occurs, but I think what the opportunity that is presented by this crisis, and as a former elected, you remember we always say you never want to waste a crisis, is there is an urgency here that I think I agree with you that is different from what we've seen before.
Yeah.
Any other commissioners, Mr. Emerson? Especially with your experience in healthcare.
Well, I think our priority is what we do with the pandemic, and I agree with David that we've got to look at that as that's the overriding thing that we have no control over. All the other issues we're talking about today, we can do something about. We've got to be prepared to meet the current wave of the pandemic, and then we know that there's a second wave coming. So I think we need to address those issues very soon.
Any other comments from commissioners? Because if not, then let me ask Ethan and Tamara and staff, do we have any folks that want to offer public comment?
I do not believe we do, but Tamara, can we double check quickly with Rachel and Ashley? In fact, Rachel and Ashley, why don't you just let us know? Do we have any requests?
There's none from email.
Okay.
And
There's none
Ashley,
online.
there,
So can I just ask a question of Ethan? And from today's session, what's the takeaway in terms of thinking forward on the next two hearings?
so we had initially discussed having the second hearing be focused rather narrowly on the state budget and fiscal effects. I do think that given some of what we've heard today and some of the witnesses we've already invited, I think it will probably be broader. I think that we should, the second hearing should probably, will include Professor Page, who will talk about economic mobility, poverty issues. We have also invited Fernando Lozano, who's the co-chair of the Governor's Council on Economic Advisors. He has said he's attempting to work that into his schedule. And if we had those two witnesses, we might want to just have two witnesses. And then the third hearing, I think, would be more narrowly focused on state budget fiscal issues. So I think we might want one additional hearing on sort of broad measure changes, particularly given, I think there's a lot of importance about the economic mobility component that Professor Page will address. Does that answer your question, David?
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Ethan, this is Dion.
Yes.
You know, I think now that I'm beginning to think about the issue regarding the impact on the state budget, kind of. I think we know that. I think I'm not so sure we need to rehash that. I think that the Department of Finance, I think that the folks we've heard from today, you know, if we said to them, what do you think the fiscal impacts are on the state budget? I don't think that's such a difficult task. I think much more difficult is what we've been talking about today, about the changing economy, how, you know, the relationship between the public and private sector, what's the state government's role in you know, understanding where the economy is going and what it is for us to do as taxpayers, right? Because it is taxpayers who make up state government, who finance it. About what our tax dollars can do to move us into the new economy. I don't know if we need to rehash what the impact has been on state government. I mean, the governor says it's 54 million. The LAO said it was something else, and whomever else to predict said it was something else, that kind of thing. And the legislature thinks it's a fourth thing. I don't know what that gets us, to be honest with you. Now, maybe others feel differently, but I don't know what it gets us in regards to saying what the impact, because it really is about the impact on the citizens of California more so, I think, that we're interested in, because this recession has been so different than the others, as we heard today. And I'm not so sure it's about, how many dollars the state government's losing, that kind of thing. But I'd be interested to hear what other commissioners think.
I think that's an important perspective. I think you're right. We can go to anybody's website, any other government entity's websites, and see what they have to say about the numbers. Yeah. What I think is a bit more challenging is I think we have enough information based on the background memo and the testimony that we heard today that we can identify the 3 or 4 sectors of the economy that are going to be the ones that are the most battered by this recession. We also know that statistically, it's heavily people of color.
Right.
So they're Latinos, African Americans, and small business owners. So if we really want to try to make people's lives better, transitioning out of this, and nobody's saying it's going to get fixed in a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, then what are the mechanisms that the state of California has in order to assist in that transition? Can the community, what does the community college have to say? Right. There's Eloy there's a reference in our background. What are they capable of doing that can help cushion the transition, that makes it better for people? And so maybe we need to hear more about the educational system. And we heard a comment that the state colleges have drifted away from their mission. And we knew that years ago when Little Hoover put together the report on the master plan is dead. That the things that were supposed to be happening with that weren't happening. So maybe it's some focus on what are we going to do to provide the best benefit and relief for the 4 industries that we know are the ones that have been slammed the hardest.
And we can certainly, Mr. Chairman, we can certainly orient the second hearing around those issues. The third hearing, what I was thinking for the third hearing is less the immediate fiscal impact, not the 54 billion versus the 40 billion, but rather sort of some of the comments that Kathy made, I think, a couple of weeks ago at our business meeting with regard to the long-term implications for tax structure, for if people drive less, what is the implication for gas tax revenue? If there is an increase in economic inequality, what are the implications for income tax revenue? Long-term things, not what's the deficit for the coming 18-month period or something, which I agree with you is not of much interest. But I don't know if commissioners are, and we can figure this out, I suppose, as we go along. But the third hearing, I was thinking more of the long-term impact on state revenue, state spending needs. Is there, for instance, a need for less spending on physical infrastructure if we're transitioning to a remote work economy, and more need for spending on digital infrastructure? Those kinds of big issues that are addressed by public policy. But
Ethan, I really like the idea of looking at education. That's kind of what I was talking about before, but I don't want to discount what Commissioner Beyer said about some of the short-term issues and the healthcare issues. And I'm not sure exactly what we would be looking at from that perspective, but I don't want to dismiss what he said, because I think that obviously there's some really important implications if we don't find some healthcare solutions to what's going on right now.
I also want to say about education, I think that, I believe education is really the path towards almost any solution. An educated electorate, an educated citizenry. I think what I'm seeing from my friends and their children who are going to college is, like, right now, they they're less inclined to want to go back to UCs or any of these big campuses because they don't want to pay for what the experience that they're not getting. They want it to be in a dorm with other college students, football, the whole experience. Otherwise, they are more inclined to go to community college or something where it's a cheaper education, particularly if they're doing it online. And what I am a little bit afraid of is that we will make recommendations on this short-term situation, and I don't want to see us destroy which is a crown jewel of the UC system. I would hate to see decisions or recommendations that don't somehow look to us going into the future where you get back to more of that communal type of education where people still go to the particular campuses. I think there's tremendous value in being with a different community than what you grew up with. You learn from those people, you interact. And so I just think that the education is not just about what we're doing right now, but the education is still about who you have dinner with at a university or something like that. So that's just my 2 cents about how we look at this going forward. I think there are also immediate implications if people don't go back to UC for a semester. There are some people who will be then dropped out of the system and they would have to reapply. Others are being given time off. So I think that there could be short-term recommendations about people shouldn't be dropped out, their loans could be extended, things like that. But I also feel that we should not we should not suddenly start talking about how it should all be commuter or something like that, or Zoom education. Just my 2 cents.
If I could comment just briefly. So when we started this conversation about having this set of hearings, I think we all were in a position of worrying that we would interfere with the executive branch activities and ask people who were very busy dealing with public health issues to testify. And that's sort of one of the reasons we went down this economic path. So a question really for the group is, how do we offer the greatest value, especially to the legislature, in terms of guidance about things economic? And is that structural? That is, how to organize the legislature or the executive branch to take into account what we've learned from the changing nature of the economy. The governor clearly has capability of doing things. He created a Council of the Economic Advisors. He has his reopening committee of 80 people. How does the legislature begin to grapple with this? And so on this question, we have 3 really experienced former legislators. I'd just like to hear from you all. If you were in the legislature today and you were looking for a little Hoover report, what would you want?
As we all speak up at once. But I see Bill leaning forward. So yeah, Bill, you should go. You were a senator, you know more.
Yeah, right. No, this is a difficult time, and I think as you see that the legislature is going back they're continuing to do business as usual. They're not addressing many of the critical issues facing the public health issues and things of that nature. So I'm not sure what they really would like to hear. I defer to you, Pedro, and to Dion about what your thoughts are, but I think we definitely need to find out how we best can resolve the biggest issue before us, and that's what the impacts of this virus are on the public health issue. I think that's perhaps the most critical, because if we don't get a handle on that, then we're going to be in the same situation further down the line.
Yeah, and I think that some of the points that that Mark Schniepp made about there's no recovery until people feel safe. Unless you feel comfortable going into a store and that you've seen that the employees are wearing masks, that you see people cleaning equipment, that you've got decals on the floor encouraging social distancing, until as a consumer you have a sense that somebody cares about your safety, you don't want to take that risk. I mean, I make that calculation all the time. About 2 weeks ago, I went into a little independent store and there was no social distancing. Customers weren't wearing masks. And I said, I'm never coming back here. I'm done. I mean, if I have to pay too much at Whole Foods, I'll go there because they're wiping down the baskets. They've got decals on the floor. They make you wear the mask. So the public health part of it is really, really important. And then I also think the other aspect of this is that people are having a hard time sort of figuring out is, what are you gonna do with the schools?
Yeah.
I mean, when do you open schools and how do you open schools? I mean, I've got a neighbor next door. She's got 2 children. One just finished, is going into middle school, and her daughter is still at elementary school. She used to have a job outside of the home where she would go while the kids were at school. She doesn't do that anymore. She can't do that anymore. They can't afford, well, there isn't childcare. So the issue of public health and the issue of opening of schools, if we start to think about what is foundational to making things better, I mean, even job training is a step or two beyond that, because you're not going to go to job training if you are a single parent taking care of the kids at home. So maybe we can talk more about the public health concerns and how you couple that with schools reopening.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier to when Nickelsburg was speaking, I'm very concerned about the rural hospital situation. These hospitals are in desperate need of funding. They're not getting it because they have no ability to do elective care. And, if we don't address that issue, then our hospital situation breaks down in the middle of a pandemic. We've got a major crisis on our hands.
Yeah, it seems to me, because I think many of us feel that this has been a rude awakening in regards to our public health system and our health system, right, in general, and that there is no planning that is done in regards to healthcare. There hasn't been planning in healthcare for years, right? I mean, the last time we ever did any kind of looking at what kind of machinery was needed was when we had a certificate of need process, and that ended in the 1980s. And so it seems to me that because it's hard for it's hard for 120 people to lead, everybody. I'm talking as an ex-legislator, right? 120 people don't lead. A governor leads. That's the role of that. I mean, that's how our government is set up, right? So to say, how do we help the legislature lead on something, that's very difficult. It might be that some members decide to get together to lead on something, but that's very unusual. The last time that I think the legislature led on something was during the energy crisis in 2001 and 2002. And that was because the administration really did not know what to do. And the legislature spent hundreds of hours together trying to figure out what to do. Whether or not we resolved it, whether or not we came up with the best solutions, I'm not the person to make that statement one way or the other. I just remember living through it. But it does seem to me that we can, wait, David, wait a minute. My husband's yelling. Whether or not we can give some guidance around how do you create a health system that can respond to pandemics, that can respond to disasters. We found out that we didn't stockpile stuff, right? Because the hospitals have a business model based on other business models where you don't stockpile things anymore. You just order enough to get through a week, that kind of thing, because that's the business model. Well, that doesn't work in disasters and pandemics. We needed to have millions and millions and millions of masks. We needed whatever it was, thousands of things to help people breathe. we needed all kinds of things. We needed not hazmat suits, but we needed coverings so that we knew that our medical staff was going to be safe as they were providing care to people who were coming into those facilities. It seems to me that those are the kinds of things we possibly could talk about in regards to the health piece of this. Ensuring, I mean, you know, because something was missing here, right? And I think it's called planning. I think it's called where we have certain requirements so that, and whether that means the taxpayers have to pay for it, right? Or it's a joint venture between the taxpayers and the private sector. I don't know, but that to me could be something where we could have a real impact. And then on the education thing, you know, I think more and more people are beginning to think, and I think when I talk about more and more people, I'm talking about more and more parents are beginning to say to themselves, is it better to have my kids at home or is it better that they be in school? And I don't mean a part day school or whatever, right? Because that doesn't, you know, because of the childcare situation, that doesn't work. And teachers have kids, everybody. And if teachers, what do you say to a teacher who's expected to be at work for 5 days when she doesn't have childcare, you know, that kind of thing. And so in the education realm, it seems to me that I'd like to hear from some people that are beginning to think about what's the best place for kids, because I'm not so sure it's being at home. I mean, I understand that the theory is that kids transmit, or could be the transmitters. I get all of that. But I think it would be interesting to hear, are there other perspectives on that at this point, given where we are at and how difficult it is to come up with alternatives. We don't have the wherewithal. We don't have enough school classrooms to have everybody social distancing in a school. I mean, it's not. Now, how do you say to a 5-year-old in preschool, you have to stay 6 feet away from your friend, you know, that kind of thing. That's not reality. It's not reality in childcare. They're telling childcare providers, you've got to do social distancing with a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old. That doesn't happen, everybody. That's not a reality that we could actually come through with, given who we're talking about. And so I think there have to be some other models here that we maybe want to hear from.
Yeah, and I think one thing on the whole public health issue, which I think has been sadly not looked at in a very positive manner, is that today in California with 58 counties, we only have 20 county hospital systems.
Exactly.
So we need to address how we deal with these public health issues. And the legislature hasn't done anything about this.
No.
And so I think this is a good place where we can provide some input on this matter that's important.
Yeah.
And as you see, county health care people are being victimized by the public in just very ugly ways. And you see a lot of those people are resigning from their positions because of threats to their lives. And so I think we just need to take a whole look at the public health issue on this.
Can you hear me? So David, you're unmuted. Were you going to say something?
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Anyone else? I want to thank everybody for staying on beyond noon. You know, our objective was to try to put together the meeting so that we would do 2 hours, but we had a very, very lively discussion. And it's now almost 1:45 or 12:45, I'm sorry. So unless there's more, Ethan, sounds to me as though we're about ready to adjourn.
I think so. I think we will continue with the second hearing focused on these larger economic questions, and then we can I can talk with commissioners and we can discuss more specific refinement for the third hearing if necessary. So,
yeah, I think you heard the commissioners pretty clearly talk about the public healthcare system, the impacts on healthcare systems, and then the educational and the schooling, particularly as it relates to elementary school children and childcare.
yes, and we could certainly look at those issues. Those may be almost separate studies, but we could certainly undertake those additionally. So,
all right. Seeing nothing else, we will adjourn. Again, thank you very much. Stay safe, stay healthy. Till next time.
Thank you.